Did you know sea animals have been documented in the past to have the ability to learn and mimic human speech? Fishermen have often reported throughout history hearing voices deep into the ocean, and maybe they were more real than people previously believed. I mean, mimicry is not an insanely unique thing in the animal world. You may even already know some animals that can mimic human speech. The most well-known animal for vocal mimicry is a parrot, with the smartest parrot, the African grey parrot, being able to learn up to 1,000 words and use them in context. These birds also sound very real, and in some cases the pronunciation is so good that it'd be hard to even tell it's a parrot speaking. But that's just a bird sitting in the cage. The horrifying part comes to the fact that these aren't just parrots learning human speech. These animals are sea animals and mammals. Just imagine you're out on a trip at sea. Your other deckhands are fast asleep and you're on the bow. You hear the cry of someone asking for help. You desperately look at the water around you trying to find someone, only to see a giant mammal in the deep watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake so you can become its next meal. One of the most creepy mammals capable of mimicry is the orca. In 2018, a study made headlines when it found that a captive orca, also known as a killer whale, was able to imitate human speech. The killer whale, called Wiki, lived at the Marineland Aquarium in Antibes, France. Wiki was trained to produce some words such as hello, Amy, and 1, 2, 3. Wiki was also later found to be able to make even more sounds like a creaky door and the ability to imitate the call of an elephant. This makes sense as orcas are able to live by communicating over vast distances to know what environment's like, where to find each other, and where to find food. Here's real audio from the orca documenting the terrifying results the researchers learned from this experiment.
Hello? 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 1, 2.
Imagine hearing that deep into your ocean voyage. Not so fun fact, this has actually been known for decades by Japanese fishermen, especially those who worked the cold water off Hokkaido in the 1960s and 70s. At the time, orca hunting wasn't illegal and small coastal crews were often sent out to kill pods, blamed for depleting fish stocks. It was difficult and dirty work, but to most of the men it was just another part of surviving at sea. What stayed with many of them over the years wasn't the danger or even the violence itself, it was the sounds. More than one crew reported hearing noises that didn't sound like any animal they had ever known. Late at night when the boat engines were silent and the sea was calm, the orcas would let out long, uneven calls that drifted across the water like voices. Some fishermen said it sounded like women crying. Others described it as children calling from under the waves. Fathers on the crew, with kids waiting for them at home, said the sound stayed in their head long after the hunts were over. A few men refused to go back out on orca trips after that. They said it felt like killing something that understood far more than it should. Some of them lost their jobs because of it. One man, years later, told a local newspaper that even now, when he hears his daughter cry, it pulls him straight back to those nights at sea, listening to something in the dark trying to speak through the wrong kind of throat. Orcas have huge brains, 3.5 times larger than humans, and specifically have the most wrinkled neocortex of any animal brain on the planet, even more wrinkled than humans. The neocortex is involved with cognition, emotion, and memory and communication, meaning that these orcas could definitely know what they're doing when calling out to Japanese fishermen in the night, or trying to talk to their captors in captivity. Beluga whales have also shown the disturbing ability to mimic human speech. In 1989, a beluga whale named Nock at a US Navy research facility surprised divers by mimicking human speech. The whale was said to be so convincing that one diver heard a clear "get out" and surfaced, thinking a fellow diver was calling out to him. The beluga whale was able to produce the sound through its nasal passages, perfectly capturing the cadence and rhythm of human speech, showing how powerful a beluga whale's vocal flexibility and intelligence really is. This mimicry showed the complex communication skills a mammal can have for copying human speech. Following this horrifying incident, researchers began recording the whale's vocalizations and trained him to reproduce them on command, rewarding him every time he got a correct vocal sound. In 2012 study, it was documented that the whale learned these speech patterns to connect with its human handlers. Here's exactly what the handlers heard. What makes this worse is what happened after the formal study ended. Once the reward stopped and the recording sessions were over, Nock kept talking alone in his tank, with no one asking him to perform and no food being offered. The whale continued to produce these human-like sounds on his own. Researchers who walked past an enclosure late in the evening reported hearing low, muttering tones rising out of the water, sounds that had no obvious reason to exist. Belugas in the wild are sometimes called sea canaries because of how loud and constant their chatter is. They produce clicks, chirps, whistles, and squeals that bounce through the water in ways researchers still do not fully understand. But Nock was producing something that carried the shape of human language without carrying any of the meaning, and that distinction is one of the most deeply unsettling things a living creature can do. What it tells us is that Nock was studying human sound the way a child studies a language they want to learn. And the question that nobody has ever been able to answer is what exactly was he preparing for? The question then becomes whether it was trying to connect with human researchers or just trying to survive. A beluga in captivity has very few tools at its disposal. It can swim in circles and it can refuse to eat, or it can copy human noises. The idea that an animal figured that out on its own should give you a real pause. Because if a captive whale can learn to mimic human speech as a survival tool, what is stopping a wild beluga from doing the exact same thing? What would happen if a diver alone in open water heard a voice behind them telling them to swim towards something they couldn't see? This case established belugas as a highly intense and socially aware animal who are capable of learning and experimenting with sounds in ways that were previously thought to only be possible by humans. The last example is of a sea animal that is a little more close to the surface: seals. Seals are one of the other few non-human animals capable of vocal learning, with the most famous example being Hoover, a harbor seal who lived at the New England Aquarium in Boston from 1971 to 1985. He was rescued and raised by a fisherman, who raised him similar to a family dog, speaking to him constantly. Human absorbed his fisherman's thick New England accent and later learned to speak, saying phrases like, "Hello there," and "Get out of here and come over." Other listeners described him as sounding somewhat inebriated because he tended to slur words together, and aquarium workers described his voice as sounding like a male human with a Boston accent. Later, other studies were done and found that you could teach other seals to talk too by training them from a young age. Hearing the voice of a human from a non-human animal is very uncanny. What is more disturbing is that Hoover did not need to be rewarded to keep speaking. He just did. Long after the fisherman who raised him has handed him over to the aquarium, Hoover still called out. Maybe he was just looking for attention, or maybe he wanted something more. Researchers who studied Hoover later confirmed that his vocal learning was rooted in something real. Harbor seals have a physical structure in their throat that gives them a rare level of control over the sounds they produce, far more than most marine animals. The same flexibility that allows them to bark and grunt can, under the right conditions, be shaped into something that sounds like words. What that means is that Hoover was working with raw materials that were already close to human. He just had to close the gap, and he did. The deeper you look at all these animals, the harder it becomes to write any of this as a coincidence or a party trick. Orcas that call out like crying women off the coast of Japan, a beluga that kept speaking long after it had any reason to do so, a seal that sounded like a fisherman. These animals were all learning that human sounds get a very human reaction, and they were using that knowledge. The ocean's enormous, and the vast majority have never been recorded, heard, or even seen. Whatever is down there has millions of years to listen to us. The sounds you heard were all caught in controlled setting by people who are looking for them. What nobody can tell you is how many times those same sounds is drifting up from the deep water in the middle of the ocean. What other creatures and monsters exist that are capable of repeating human voices? Fishermen have often reported hearing voices out at sea, voices in places where it'd be almost impossible for any humans to be or survive. Sure, those voices could be due to whale noises or just fishermen going insane, or it could be coming from another animal humans have not yet come into contact with, an animal we may never know is making those noises, or why.